The morning sun cast long shadows across the crowded train platform as Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn leather jacket and checked his watch. The 7:15 express to Chicago was already pulling into the station, its steel wheels grinding against the tracks with a familiar screech that reminded him of distant battlefields. He had been making this same journey every month for the past 3 years, visiting his aging mother in the city, but today would be different in ways he could never have imagined. As the train doors hissed open, Marcus found himself swept along with the usual crowd of commuters, business travelers, and weekend visitors. The car was packed beyond capacity, every seat filled, and passengers already beginning to crowd the aisles. He managed to secure a spot near the middle of the car, gripping the metal rail as the train lurched into motion. That's when he noticed him. An elderly man sat hunched in a window seat about 10 feet away, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they rested on a simple wooden walking cane. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't just the man's age, which appeared to be somewhere in his 80s, but the small pin on his faded jacket lapel. Even from a distance, Marcus could make out the distinctive shape of a dragon, the symbol that had haunted his own dreams for years. The Dragon Division. The 40th Infantry Division of the California National Guard. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as memories flooded back, unbidden. The old man's face was etched with lines that spoke of decades lived under the weight of experiences most people could never comprehend. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a depth that Marcus recognized immediately. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, carried too much. The same eyes Marcus saw in his own mirror each morning. As the train picked up speed, rolling through the suburban landscape, Marcus found himself studying the veteran more closely. The man's posture suggested pain, the way his shoulders curved inward as if protecting something fragile within. His breathing appeared labored, each inhalation a conscious effort, yet there was dignity in the way he sat, a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding attention. Marcus knew the history of the Dragon Division, had studied it extensively during his own military service. Formed during World War II, the unit had earned its fearsome reputation across multiple conflicts, from the beaches of Luzon in the Philippines to the frozen hills of Korea, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East. The Dragon had been there. The division had participated in some of the most brutal campaigns of the 20th and 21st centuries, earning battle honors that read like a geography lesson in human suffering. But it was more than just military history that connected Marcus to this stranger. 3 years earlier, Marcus had received a letter from the Veterans Administration that changed everything he thought he knew about his own family. His grandfather, who had died when Marcus was just a child, had served with the Dragon Division during the Korean War. The letter contained his grandfather's military records, finally declassified after decades of bureaucratic delays. Reading those documents had been like discovering a hidden chapter of his own identity. His grandfather, Thomas Thompson, had been part of the Dragon's push north of the 38th parallel in 1951. The records detailed how his unit had been surrounded by Chinese forces near the Chosin Reservoir, how they had fought their way out through a gauntlet of enemy positions in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Thomas had been wounded twice during that retreat, had carried a wounded comrade for 3 miles through knee-deep snow, and had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor. Marcus had never known any of this. His grandfather had never spoken of the war, had taken those stories to his grave, along with the nightmares that his grandmother had whispered about during family gatherings. The discovery had sent Marcus on a journey of understanding that led him to veteran support groups, to historical archives, to conversations with other families struggling to piece together the fragments of their loved ones' wartime experiences. As the train swayed gently through a curve, Marcus watched the old Dragon veteran close his eyes and lean his head back against the seat. Even in rest, there was tension in his features, as if sleep brought no peace from whatever battles continued to rage in his mind. Marcus wondered about this man's story, about which campaigns he had survived, about what ghosts walked with him through his daily life. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the next stop. Several passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. A businessman in an expensive suit stood up from his seat near the front of the car, checking his phone as he moved toward the exit. For a moment, Marcus felt a surge of hope that perhaps the old veteran might be able to move to the now empty seat, to have more room to stretch his obviously aching limbs. But before the dragon veteran could even begin to rise, a young woman who had been standing in the aisle quickly claimed the vacant spot. She settled in with her laptop and headphones, completely oblivious to the elderly man struggling just a few feet away. Marcus felt a familiar anger begin to build in his chest, the same righteous fury that had gotten him into trouble more than once during his own military service. The train continued its journey, stopping at small towns and suburban stations, each time bringing hope that a seat might become available for the veteran. And each time, other passengers, younger and more agile, claimed the empty spots before the old man could even attempt to move. Marcus watched this pattern repeat itself with growing frustration, his knuckles white as he gripped the metal rail. By the time the train was halfway to Chicago, it became clear to Marcus that none of the other passengers had noticed the dragon pin. Or if they had, they simply didn't understand its significance. To them, he was just another elderly passenger, no different from any other traveler. They couldn't see the weight of history he carried, couldn't recognize the sacrifices written in the lines of his face. But Marcus could see it all. Every time the old man winced as the train jolted over a rough section of track, Marcus felt it in his own bones. Every time the veteran adjusted his position, trying futilely to find comfort in the cramped space, Marcus remembered his grandfather's stories about sleeping in foxholes and marching on frozen feet. This wasn't just about an old man needing a seat. This was about honor, about recognition, about the debt that every free person owed to those who had paid the price for that freedom. As they approached another station, Marcus made his decision. It wasn't a grand gesture born of sudden inspiration, but rather the quiet conviction that some things were simply right, regardless of personal cost. He had been standing for over an hour already, his own back beginning to ache from the constant swaying motion of the train. The remaining journey to Chicago would take at least another 2 hours, possibly more if they encountered delays. But as Marcus looked at the dragon veteran, still sitting with that quiet dignity despite his obvious discomfort, he knew that his own minor inconvenience paled in comparison to what this man had endured. The old soldier had stood his ground in places where standing meant the difference between life and death, had remained upright when everything around him was falling apart. The least Marcus could do was stand for him now, in this small act of recognition and respect. The train pulled into the next station, with its familiar grinding of brakes and hissing of air. Passengers shuffled toward the doors, while others prepared to board. Marcus remained where he was, his decision made, his resolve firm. He would stand for the entire remaining journey, not because he had to, but because it was right. Because somewhere in the vast network of human connection that binds us all together, this old dragon veteran was family, a brother in arms separated by decades but united by understanding. As the train lurched back into motion, Marcus caught the veteran's eye for just a moment. The old man nodded slightly, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that somehow conveyed more than words ever could. In that instant, Marcus felt the presence of his grandfather, felt the weight of all the stories that had never been told, all the sacrifices that had gone unrecognized. The journey to Chicago stretched ahead of them, but Marcus was no longer thinking about his destination. He was thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment, about the invisible threads that connected past and present, about the simple but profound truth that honor is not a grand gesture, but a quiet choice made when no one else is watching. The train had been traveling for nearly 2 hours, when something unexpected happened that would transform Marcus's simple gesture into something much larger than either he or the dragon veteran could have anticipated. As they pulled away from a small station outside the Chicago suburbs, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen boarded the car with her teenage daughter Emma. Sarah immediately noticed the crowded conditions and began looking for any available seating. Her eyes swept across the car, taking in the various passengers, when she spotted the elderly man with the dragon pin on his jacket. Unlike the other travelers who had passed by without recognition, Sarah stopped in her tracks. Her father had served with the 40th Infantry Division during the Vietnam War. She had grown up hearing stories about the dragon, about the brotherhood that existed among its members, about the terrible price they had paid for their service. More importantly, she had watched her father struggle with the invisible wounds of war for decades, had seen how the world's indifference to veteran sacrifices had slowly eaten away at his spirit until he took his own life on a rainy Thursday morning in 2018. "Emma," she whispered to her daughter, pointing discreetly toward the veteran. "Do you see that pin on that gentleman's jacket?" 17-year-old Emma followed her mother's gaze and shrugged. "It's a dragon or something." "So what? That man is a war hero," Sarah explained quietly. "He's served his country in ways we can barely imagine. And look at him, struggling to stay comfortable while people half his age sit in comfort around him." Emma looked again, this time seeing beyond the simple image of an elderly passenger. She noticed how the man's hands shook slightly, how he periodically pressed his lips together as if fighting back pain, how his eyes held a distant quality that seemed to be looking at something far beyond the train window. As Sarah and Emma stood in the aisle, still processing the situation, they became aware that someone else had already taken notice. Marcus, still gripping the metal rail about 10 feet away, had been standing for the entire journey so far. At first, Sarah assumed he simply hadn't been able to find a seat, but as she watched more carefully, she realized something different was happening. Marcus wasn't just standing because he had to. Every time a seat became available, he made no move to claim it. Instead, he remained positioned where he could keep the dragon veteran in his line of sight. When the train swayed and other standing passengers stumbled, Marcus planted his feet wider and rode out the motion with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to maintaining balance under difficult conditions. Most telling of all, whenever the veteran shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Marcus's jaw would tighten with what appeared to be sympathetic pain. "Mom," Emma said suddenly, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "I think that guy is standing on purpose." For the old man, Sarah looked again at Marcus and felt a rush of recognition. She had seen that expression before, in her father's eyes when he talked about his fellow soldiers, in the faces of veterans at Memorial Day ceremonies, in the bearing of men and women who understood that service meant putting others before yourself. This wasn't just about a train ride. This was about something much deeper. The train hit a rough patch of track, and the dragon veteran winced as the jarring motion aggravated what was clearly chronic pain. Marcus immediately took a half step closer, as if he might need to provide assistance, though he was careful not to hover or make the old man feel watched. Sarah made a decision that would ripple through the train car in ways she never expected. She approached Marcus directly, her daughter following uncertainly behind. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help but notice that you've been standing this whole time, and I think I know why." Marcus turned to her with a guarded expression. He wasn't used to strangers commenting on his personal choices, and his military training had taught him to be cautious about unsolicited attention. "I saw the pin," Sarah continued, nodding toward the dragon veteran. "My father served with the 40th Infantry Division in Vietnam. He never talked much about it, but he talked about the brotherhood, about how dragon soldiers looked out for each other, no matter what." Marcus's expression softened immediately. "What was your father's name?" "Staff Sergeant Robert Chen. He was with the division from 1968 to 1970. Marcus nodded slowly. "The dragon was in some heavy fighting during those years. Your father was part of something important. He never felt like the world recognized that," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "He struggled with that until the day he died." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Emma, meanwhile, was experiencing something she had never felt before. Her grandfather's military service had always been an abstract concept, something that happened in a different world before she was born. But seeing this stranger honor an elderly veteran, hearing her mother speak about her grandfather's pain, she began to understand that this history wasn't abstract at all. It was real. It was present. And it demanded recognition. "What can we do?" Emma asked suddenly, surprising both her mother and Marcus. "What do you mean?" Marcus replied. "I mean, you're standing to honor him, right? But he doesn't have a seat. And you're going to be exhausted by the time we get to Chicago. There has to be something we can do." "Well," Marcus smiled at the teenager's directness. "Sometimes, the gesture is more important than the comfort. He's carried weight for all of us. The least I can do is carry my own weight for him." But Emma wasn't satisfied with that answer. She looked around the train car with new eyes, seeing not just a collection of random passengers, but a microcosm of the society her grandfather had fought to protect. And right now, that society was failing one of its heroes. "Mom, can you record something on your phone?" Sarah looked confused. "Record what?" "Just trust me. Start recording, but be discreet about it." Emma took a deep breath and did something that would change everything. In a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the train car, she began to speak. "Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to tell you about someone on this train." Conversations stopped. Passengers looked up from their phones and newspapers. The businessman who had earlier claimed a seat without a second thought about the elderly veteran now found himself paying attention to a teenager's words. "That gentleman sitting by the window," Emma continued, pointing respectfully toward the Dragon veteran, "is wearing a pin that represents the 40th Infantry Division, known as the Dragon Division. This military unit has served our country in every major conflict since World War II, from the Pacific Theater to Korea, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan." The elderly veteran looked up in surprise, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. But Emma wasn't finished. "The man standing over there," she gestured toward Marcus, "has been standing for over 2 hours. Not because he couldn't find a seat, but because he recognizes what that pin means. He's choosing to stand in honor of someone who stood for all of us when it mattered most." A murmur began to spread through the car as passengers started to look more closely at both men. Some seemed genuinely moved by Emma's words, while others appeared uncomfortable with being called out, however indirectly, for their inattention. "My grandfather served with the Dragon Division in Vietnam," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He came home to a country that didn't want to hear about what he'd been through, that didn't want to acknowledge what he'd sacrificed. He lived with that rejection for 50 years before he couldn't live with it anymore. Thank you for watching. And we look in faces, and we see that The train car had fallen completely silent now. Even the businessman who had claimed the earlier seat was listening intently, his phone forgotten in his hand. "I never got to thank my grandfather for what he did," Emma said, her voice beginning to waver with emotion. "But I can thank this man." She turned toward the Dragon veteran, who was now looking directly at her with tears beginning to form in his weathered eyes. "Sir, I don't know your name, and I don't know which wars you fought in, but I know that you stood for something bigger than yourself when it would have been easier to walk away. And I want you to know that there are people who see that, who remember that, who honor that." What happened next would be talked about for months afterward by everyone who witnessed it. The businessman who had claimed the earlier seat stood up abruptly and walked over to the Dragon veteran. "Sir," he said simply, "would you please take my seat?" Before the veteran could respond, a woman in her 30s who had been sitting near the front of the car also stood up. "Or mine," she offered. Within seconds, half a dozen passengers were on their feet, offering their seats to the elderly veteran. But more than that, they were looking at him with new eyes. Seeing not just an old man taking up space but a living piece of their nation's history. The Dragon veteran sat silent for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of attention and respect. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet car, everyone could hear him. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just did my job." Marcus, still standing nearby, caught the veteran's eye and smiled. "Sir, with respect, doing your job when your job was serving in hell. That's pretty special." As passengers began settling into their new seating arrangements, ensuring the veteran had his choice of comfortable spots, Sarah continued recording on her phone. She had initially started filming at her daughter's request, not really understanding why. But as she watched the scene unfold, she realized she was capturing something precious. A moment when strangers chose to see beyond themselves, when recognition was finally given to someone who had earned it decades ago. The transformation that occurred in that train car during the final hour of the journey to Chicago was unlike anything any of the passengers had experienced before. What began as Marcus's quiet act of respect had become something much larger. A spontaneous community of recognition that seemed to awaken something fundamental in everyone present. The Dragon veteran, whose name they learned was Colonel Frank Morrison, retired, had finally accepted a window seat offered by a young software developer named Jake Williams. But rather than simply settling into comfort and silence, Colonel Morrison began to do something he hadn't done in decades. He started to share his story. It began quietly, with Jake asking a simple question about the dragon pin. Colonel Morrison's weathered hands traced the small insignia as he explained its meaning, and gradually, other passengers began to gather around, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed to hear. "I enlisted in 1965, Colonel Morrison began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I was 19 years old and thought I knew everything about the world. The Dragon Division had already been fighting in Vietnam for 2 years when I got there, and they were preparing for what would become some of the heaviest fighting of the war." Marcus had found a seat nearby, finally accepting the invitation from several passengers who insisted he rest after his hours of standing. But he remained focused entirely on Colonel Morrison's words, recognizing in them echoes of his own grandfather's experience in Korea. "The thing people don't understand about war," Colonel Morrison continued, "is that it's not really about politics or strategy, or even courage. It's about the person standing next to you. It's about making sure your brothers come home." Emma, who had sparked this entire transformation with her impromptu speech, sat cross-legged on the floor near Colonel Morrison's seat, her phone forgotten as she hung on every word. Her generation had grown up with war as a distant abstraction, something that happened to other people in other places. But listening to Colonel Morrison, she began to understand that war was profoundly personal, that every conflict was made up of individual human beings, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. "We were at Firebase Alpha in 1968 when the Tet Offensive began," Colonel Morrison said, his eyes taking on that distant quality that Sarah had noticed earlier. "We'd been getting intelligence reports for weeks that something big was coming, but nothing could have prepared us for what actually happened." He paused, and in that silence, the entire car seemed to hold its breath. Outside the windows, the Chicago skyline was beginning to appear on the horizon, but no one was paying attention to the approaching destination. For 3 days, we were surrounded by North Vietnamese forces that outnumbered us by at least 5-1. We lost communication with headquarters. We were running low on ammunition, and we had 17 wounded men who needed medical evacuation. That wasn't coming. Colonel Morrison's hands began to tremble slightly as he spoke, and Sarah noticed that several of the listening passengers had tears in their eyes. This wasn't just a war story. It was a testament to human endurance under impossible circumstances. On the third night, my commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, made a decision that saved all our lives. He organized a fighting withdrawal that would take us through 2 miles of enemy territory to reach a landing zone where helicopters might be able to extract us. But it meant carrying our wounded through jungle terrain under constant fire. Marcus leaned forward, completely absorbed in the account. This was the kind of story his grandfather had never been able to tell. The kind of experience that had shaped an entire generation of soldiers who came home to a world that didn't want to hear about what they'd been through. "We made it to the landing zone just as the first helicopter arrived," Colonel Morrison continued. "But there wasn't room for everyone on the first bird. Captain Rodriguez insisted that all the wounded go first, along with the youngest soldiers. He stayed behind with a handful of volunteers to hold the LZ until the second helicopter could arrive." Colonel Morrison stopped speaking for a long moment, his breathing becoming labored. When he continued, his voice was barely audible. "That second helicopter never came. Captain Rodriguez and 6 other dragon soldiers died holding that landing zone, so the rest of us could get out. They were all between 19 and 23 years old. The silence that followed was profound. In a train car full of strangers, Colonel Morrison had shared something that had clearly haunted him for more than 50 years. But rather than the isolation he had apparently lived with for decades, he was surrounded by people who were genuinely listening, genuinely trying to understand. Jake, the software developer who had given up his seat, spoke first. Colonel Morrison, how did you carry that with you? How did you come home from something like that and just live a normal life? Colonel Morrison smiled sadly. You don't, son. You learn to live with it, but it's never normal. Every day for the last 56 years, I've thought about those 7 men who didn't come home. Every time I've sat down to a meal they'll never taste. Every time I've watched a sunset they'll never see. Every time I've held my grandchildren, they'll never meet. Emma, still sitting on the floor, found herself crying openly. But you did come home. You did live. Doesn't that honor them somehow? I've spent most of my life wondering about that, Colonel Morrison replied. Wondering if I deserved to survive when they didn't. Wondering if anything I did afterward was worth their sacrifice. Marcus, who had remained silent through most of the story, finally spoke up. Colonel Morrison, sir. With respect, you've been asking the wrong question. The elderly veteran turned to look at Marcus with curiosity. The question isn't whether you deserve to survive, Marcus continued. The question is whether we deserve what you all sacrificed to give us. And the answer to that depends on what we do with the life and freedom you preserved. Marcus gestured around the train car, at the diverse group of passengers who had come together around Colonel Morrison's story. Look at this moment, sir. Look at what happened here today. A teenager decided to speak up for a stranger. A businessman gave up his seat. A mother shared her father's story. Complete strangers chose to listen to difficult truths about sacrifice and service. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. That doesn't happen in countries where freedom isn't protected. That doesn't happen in places where people don't have the liberty to choose compassion over convenience. You and Captain Rodriguez and those 6 soldiers, you made this possible. Sarah, who had been recording the entire conversation, found herself moved beyond words. Her father's pain, his sense that the world didn't recognize his sacrifice, had poisoned his final years. But watching Colonel Morrison receive genuine gratitude and recognition from strangers, she began to understand that healing was possible, even decades after the wounds were inflicted. As the train began its final approach to Chicago's Union Station, something remarkable continued to unfold. Passengers who had been complete strangers hours earlier were exchanging contact information, making plans to stay in touch, talking about ways to support veterans in their own communities. Jake pulled out his laptop and showed Colonel Morrison a website he had been working on during the journey, a platform designed to connect veterans with volunteer opportunities to share their stories in schools and community centers. Colonel Morrison, would you consider being our first featured speaker? The businessman, whose name turned out to be David Chen, no relation to Sarah, had been quietly making phone calls throughout Colonel Morrison's story. He approached the veteran as the train pulled into the station. Sir, my company has a corporate foundation that supports veteran causes. After hearing your story, I want to fund a scholarship in honor of Captain Rodriguez and those 6 soldiers who died at Firebase Alpha. Would you help us design a program that would make them proud? Colonel Morrison sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and recognition. For decades, he had carried his memories in isolation, convinced that civilian society neither understood nor cared about military sacrifice. But in the space of a few hours, that assumption had been completely overturned. As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Emma approached Colonel Morrison one final time. Sir, can I ask you something personal? Colonel Morrison nodded. Do you think Captain Rodriguez and the others would be proud of who you became? Of the life you lived after they died? Colonel Morrison considered the question carefully. I became a teacher, he said finally. Taught high school history for 35 years. Coached baseball. Raised 2 daughters and helped raise 4 grandchildren. Volunteered at the VA hospital every Saturday for the last 20 years. Emma smiled through her tears. I think they'd be proud, sir. I think they'd say their sacrifice mattered. As the train came to a complete stop and passengers began filing off, Marcus found himself walking beside Colonel Morrison toward the exit. The elderly veteran moved slowly but with obvious purpose, his wooden cane tapping against the floor with each step. Young man, Colonel Morrison said quietly, I don't know why you chose to stand for me today, but I want you to know it meant more than you can imagine. Marcus helped Colonel Morrison down the steps onto the platform, where the controlled chaos of Union Station swirled around them. Sir, my grandfather served with the Dragon Division in Korea. I found out about it after he died, and I always regretted that I never got to thank him for his service. Standing for you. It felt like standing for him too. Opan. Amnem. Amnem for stemmed. I'm seen. I'm winstemmed. Colonel Morrison stopped walking and turned to face Marcus directly. With hands that no longer trembled, he reached up and removed the dragon pin from his jacket lapel. Then, this belongs to your family, he said, pressing the small insignia into Marcus's palm. Sir, I can't accept this. Young man, the dragon doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to everyone who understands that freedom requires guardians. Your grandfather earned this pin in Korea. You earned it today on this train. As Marcus closed his fingers around the small piece of metal, he felt the weight of history, of connection, of responsibility that stretched across generations. The dragon pin was warm from Colonel Morrison's body heat, worn smooth by decades of handling. But it carried with it something infinitely precious. Recognition, respect, and the knowledge that service and sacrifice matter. Around them, the other passengers from their train car were slowly dispersing into the crowds of Union Station. But the connections formed during that journey would endure. Sarah would eventually create a documentary about her father's service, inspired by Colonel Morrison's courage in sharing his story. Emma would change her college major to history, determined to ensure that future generations understood the true cost of freedom. Jake's website would become a national platform connecting veterans with opportunities to share their experiences. And Marcus would wear his grandfather's dragon pin every day for the rest of his life, a reminder that honor is not a grand gesture, but a quiet choice, made again and again, whenever someone chooses to stand for something larger than themselves.